Hello, Internet. Welcome to another Wednesday Serial. This time I want to talk about the Batman White Knight books. I find these to be a really interesting take on Batman, and I'm not reading any other Batman anymore. I came back to this because of Sean Murphy, because I just love him as an artist and creator. So I came to this book because of the creator first. It was interesting reading it because his understanding of Batman seems very informed with my understanding of Batman. It's rooted in the 90s cartoon idea with Harley Quinn and Bullock and all that. And there's a play with Harley Quinn in here because there's two Harley Quinns technically to kind of separate the Harley that we knew from the 90s from the more modern kind of Jimmy Pimolotti, Amanda Connor spawned Harley Quinn that we also saw more of in the cartoon if you watch that. Her own cartoon, not the 90s cartoon. Realize that could be confusing. So, yeah, the one that came out just a few years ago. Man, I think there's a lot here. It's interestingly ground in that. In this, actually, in this White Knight book, Batman's a side character, which is where he is best. But more interestingly to me, for it, it's one of the few times I've read Batman in years where the Batman character is interesting because he's failing throughout these books. He'll win fights, but for what's of interest to the book, for what the book is trying to say, he's slowly learning that he was wrong, which I think is almost necessary to move with Batman. But in these Elseworld books, we're able to play away from the normal Bat mythos, this idea of superheroes as legends, and tales told, recycled in new ways. I, I think there's a strength there. And what's really interesting, what really sets these books apart, is how the Joker is played. Joker is not this enigma that happens unto Gotham, this unknowable boogeyman. He is, as we see mostly through the prequel slash sequel, because there's a lot informed that goes before White Knight that is shown in this book, but parts of this come after and is now not the latest, but the latest collected edition. We see Jack Napier came up and Harleen were together. And as she's working on her doctorate, he's with her, and then a lot of the break happens when she's writing about him and his condition because he has this kind of underlying personality within him. We're seeing the echoes of the Joker, but it's not like named or there yet. And we see that boil over, but it's not just he got hit with acid and blah. It's this building psychological idea, and it's a true horror idea. It's like a split between a body horror and a psychological horror, in that there's like another personality inside him. And in this take, the Joker has dual colored eyes, which is actually a physical representation of people when they have severe potential mood swings in certain conditions. Also, when the Joker's fully formed post the acid bath, the hair will change, the white goes completely there. But Jack Napier is supposed to be relatively pale as well, but he still looks human by comparison, which almost makes the Joker seem creepier, I think. Because it's a lot of physical manifestations of like a mental illness like popping out rather than just being a twisted person, like knowing it's this other personality and that there's a good man beneath almost makes it more tangible to like how the horrible things he does pulls through. Yeah, it really shook me in a way that is interesting because, like everybody else in American culture right now, I'm a bit fatigued with different takes and ideas on the Joker. This is the only one that's really done anything for me. Hooray for comics. So, when we're actually building through this White Knight idea, the Joker is fading for a while, and we get Jack Napier coming back, and he's brilliant, and he wants to stick it to Batman by beating him in a way. But to do so, he sets up a new division of the police based on this Batman fund. This idea that there's no damage control in DC, right? So there's this fund put away that's some astronomical, hilarious amount of money that Jack wants to redistribute to set up the cops with training and having the equivalent of Batmobiles and other Batman level tech. But he's also going to get the Bat family, in this case Nightwing and Batgirl, to come on, which plays into the Gordon drama that happens throughout here and whatnot. And also Duke, who is represented also when Jack is building his political power to get an elected position to make this happen. He leans on Duke, who is the leader of the redlined district within Gotham, which is a really strong way to play this because for an inner city idea of what Gotham is supposed to represent, whether you think it's New York, Chicago, whatever, this idea that these racial tensions should be brought out, adds a lot of depth and interest to the area, building on these political themes that the White Knight universe is very focused on, and also kind of explains why Batman is usually only dealing with white people, but will sometimes have black people, but like why it's usually on one part of town or the other. Having a true red line district within that, as him being a billionaire, adds a kind of like weight and interest that isn't leaned on too heavily in here, but lends a credence with something that's not even said to kind of add a little insidious or unintended consequence to how Batman goes about his operations that I thought was really interesting. So we go through this, and ultimately we find out that Batman realizes he's been wrong, and he's been wrong to keep his identity from Gordon and all this. There's so many wonderful things in this book. It's well worth checking out if you happen to just go through it. I don't think I could explain it all, but I took so much from this rereading it. I didn't enjoy it the first time because I was so wrapped up in this idea of Comicsgate and the SJW crowd and like who's what and what creator is what, and it got in my head that Sean Murphy was trying to like do something against a party with it. What I see now rereading it is that he was tapping into that tension, because much like Frank Miller's Batman, he does have kind of some news talking heads, though they are pulled back and we actually get moments with those characters where it's them talking, which I think is strong because I don't think the just talking heads pages are great comics per se. I think having a few of those talking heads like really evokes that idea and kind of gives you that news face, but then pulling back to that talking allows the page to be read a lot easier. And I think it reflects more of how we digest that sort of news anymore, because it's not news, it's editorial, and it's these people talking. So I think it's a step beyond what Frank Miller did. Better comics. And seeing them talk and have this play of, because most of their stuff is focused around the time when Jack Napier is coming out and pushing for some of these things, but he has to kind of disassociate himself from the Joker and make people realize he's Jack Napier and not the Joker, which is also necessary for the narrative for us as readers to understand that this is different as well. And you have this one female commentator who is willing to listen to him and hear about how Batman did more damage trying to like track him down. And this one guy is like, it's the Joker, he did all this stuff. And then she says allegedly, and in this universe the only thing that they've really pinned Joker for is armed robbery. But he's thought to have done all these other things, but he wasn't caught, and so he was never prosecuted, so you couldn't legally or necessarily hold him to something. And it was interesting to hear that, because I'm thinking about, like, okay, if we had any characters like this, the way our news stations are, there would definitely be a divide on who's pro Batman and who's pro Joker. And once one side picked one, the other side would pick the other. And the idea that the more conservative Republican Fox News talking head guy would be pro Batman, and then ultimately, with any little twist, anything to make it nicer, suddenly the other side supporting the Joker fit. But through this, it's so interesting to see, because I definitely went onto YouTube and watched a few reviews of this book, and there's definitely a lot of the Comicsgate crowd talking about how Sean Murphy is sticking it to the SJWs because they're supporting the Joker. And I'm like, you didn't read the book. Because it's complicated, because when the Joker comes back, yes, they're wrong, but when Jack Napier is in control, he's making all the right moves. Not always for the right reasons either, but it's really interesting. But the just political polarization of it is just wrong in every way, because everyone's misrepresented, and it's none of the humanity of it. It's really tightly crafted. What I find most fascinating about that is it's this really tight craft from a cartoonist who is definitively art first. This is somewhere where the art doesn't really lend to this idea. It's solely in the dialogue. And it's really interesting. It was very worth revisiting. Once we get here, the Joker is back, though we get flashes of Jack because we have to for this at this point. But it's built around Azrael, but this Azrael is really like a dark mirror to Batman and his family identity and how that plays through. And there's aspects of this book that I like less that are tied to Nazi Germany and World War II through the Mr. Freeze character, which is a nifty idea, but it's just so... Do we have to go to World War II? Like, especially since these are relatively recent, like that feels like a long time ago, and to pull it through is weird. But definitely read the first book if you find it compelling. I think the second book is worth it. The Harley Quinn story didn't do a ton for me. There's interesting stuff in here, but it feels like it's more of an exploration of this Harley Quinn character and where she was kind of before and after these events, because so much is squared on her, which is interesting because this is really building up Harley Quinn to be a major part of the Batman mythos in a way that is good, because there is some straight sexism and gender imbalance in these books, again because we're dealing with some of the straight like racial tensions of the day, some of the gender stuff of the day is here, and Harley Quinn is representing kind of another side of it and dealing with motherhood now. it's it's good, but it doesn't have the larger interests of the other two books, which is what really made me gravitate towards them in this reread, and instead is more of a personal discovery. It's good, but coming off the other two books, it just doesn't quite do the same. So I don't know. I think this is cool. This is about the only DC I've read in a good long while that I really enjoyed. I think DC is not doing much to be interested right now, and I know I have some friends online who are enjoying DC so much more than me, and that's great, but overall, I think the entire line kind of needs a kick in the pants. I don't think there's that much worth reading there, though I haven't obviously read any much, because every time I dip my toe in, I'm not very compelled to keep going. So seeing stuff like this, I think is the best use of the characters, especially because I don't think DC's doing continuity stuff very well right now, and so playing outside of continuity is great. The other thing is this is a Batman thing. It's the only Batman thing I've read in a long time I enjoyed, and with Batman, they're just playing the numbers, aren't they? So, um, I'm hoping I'm hoping the next book is more to my liking, because I know that's supposed to be playing with some of the Terry McGinnis stuff and some of the other ideas. I think it should be compelling, and I'm hoping to look at the next. The other thought I had while going through these books is that there's a lot of play with consequences. Normally, with superhero stories, when you deal with high levels of morality and play to political or philosophical ideas, they'll bring them up in the face of a villain or something. Like typically with Batman, you'll have a poison ivy, and there's some really good points raised about, yeah, she is an eco-terrorist, but generally what she's trying to achieve is good. But then they'll kind of eschew the entire point that she's making because she's a cold-blooded murderer and she kills a bunch of people, and then suddenly you can't be on her side anymore. And then we just kind of avoid that. Here, those ideas are carried forward while they have the heightened action. And I think that's very compelling, because I wish more books would take whatever ideas that they're playing with and play them through to the end, not tuck it in a corner and move on, feeling like they wrote themselves into a corner where maybe they have to admit that the protagonist is doing something wrong, that in this case Batman goes to jail, and he should be, and he stays there. And there's a bit of play with the fact that Batman can break out at any time, so there's someone there to make sure he stays because he's Batman. But I think that's really compelling, because not many books, even in an Elseworld situation, are willing to go through with that or stick tight enough to a story to make that land. Ironically, in that end, Spider-Man Life Story came to mind to me, because it's a story that feels like it should have dealt with more consequences in playing through, because it's dealing with Peter Parker as he ages. I don't think there's enough crotchety Peter Parker in there, especially in the 80s book. But there aren't many consequences in that book, because they keep hopping a decade every time. Now we get a little flash, but then, for instance, Captain America shows up a few times throughout that book, but every time we do, he's almost a different character in a different situation. We don't understand the playthrough of what happened with him. And you could argue, well, Marvel's going to do a Captain America life story at some point, and then we'll see that whole line. Okay, but for Spider-Man Life Story, which is one of the 2 life stories published so far, and I haven't read the Fantastic Four one yet, we have a side character that is so wildly inconsistent they might as well use different characters. And we have our main character with no real carry through on any of the story. There's no real consequence throughout those books. It's just like a slice of the life at the moment. And for that, it's not nearly as strong as this because we're seeing the weight of consequences, which I also thought was interesting because recently I tried to put together a list. My friend was asking for comic book recommendations, and I did a whole thing. If you follow me on Twitter, you saw it. It was a belaboredly long list with kind of some different sections. But what's funny is a lot of what I was recommending was like the obvious like brass ring Vertigo runs, Preacher, Transmet, whatever, pointing at things like Akira, or in my case, the Ninja Turtles IDW run. But as I was pointing to a lot of different comics and some shorter form stuff intentionally and whatnot, and trying to find some Marvel and DC to point to because they're the 2 largest publishers for American comics, I feel like you should point to some of that stuff. I felt like I needed to put some Batman on the list, but thinking about it, the only one I could recommend was Batman 2. Batman Year 2. And that was it. And I was trying to think of Spider-Man, and I came up with a few because I've read so much Spider-Man. But what's funny to me is like there's so much Spider-Man I want to recommend, but those are recommending like Spider-Man comics. And these ongoing superhero things are great if you want to get invested in that kind of a run. But to just someone who wants to read some stuff, putting them to some of these runs is just unfathomable. Like, you have to buy in so much. It's all soap opera. You have to just kind of jump in at one week. Maybe there's a cleaner point to jump in, and then if you keep reading for a while, it all starts to click for a while. And there will be different eras, but there's not so many clean lines. There's not so many great stories, like trade worth of something you could throw someone and be like, yeah. Like, it was really easy for me to put the Dark Phoenix saga on that list because it's a cutout chunk of X-Men that I read on its own back in the day, and I know it works, but I also know really, like, you probably need a couple comics before, at least one comic after what they normally contain within the Dark Phoenix saga for all the best of it. And I don't know, it just kind of got me thinking about, what works, what can you really point to recommend. And part of the reason that list spurred me to read this was 2 things I put on that list was Tokyo Ghost and Punk Rock Jesus. I genuinely believe those are great comics that tons of people should check out. And I was like, well, let's read some Sean Murphy tonight, and went for it. I think it's interesting for all the comics arena, as much as I'm diving deep into Marvel and whatnot. I'm doing that for me, for my fascination, but I'm also very acutely aware that I can talk to some people about that, but like to even try to talk to my friends who aren't into that sort of thing, to even like get to what I want to talk about takes so much goddamn preamble. By the time I get to my point, they're asleep. So, I don't know. On one hand, I'm looking at a few things. I almost feel like I should do a different video, but I'm just going to keep rambling here. some stuff I want to read coming up. I'm just looking at shelves of stuff I bought recently. I'm working really diligently on trying to get as much of the Daredevil run as possible. When I say run, I mean every Daredevil comic ever published. And I'm pretty far along. I'm working on my early years. I'm counting the Daredevil omnibus as those issues, and that's fine. But filling in between that and kind of my whole, because there's a whole of about there to issue 100, and then from there I'm pretty well sorted. First appearance of Bullseye, I have a facsimile. First appearance of Elektra, need to figure something out there. But I got time. That's something I really want to jump on, but I also want to jump on reading Madman, because I've went on an Alred kick incidentally this year. For whatever reason, I got a bugaboo to read the Dan Slott Silver Surfer run, and that was great. And then when I was done with that, I finished up my X-Force read-through, which led into the preamble to X-Statix, and I should read X-Statix. But once I'm done with all that, I mean, like, I've read most of Alred's stuff at this point, because I also read his run with Matt Fraction on Fantastic Four when I was going through a couple runs of Fantastic Four, which I talked about already. So, I know there's like a Spider-Man annual, read that forever ago. The Untold Tales of Spider-Man. Sorry, every time I say Untold, I say talks in my mind first, just years of that. But that Alred issue didn't capture me then. I almost kind of want to go to it now, because I didn't like Alred for years. And then recently, I came around on him. I think I've kind of gone through another kind of evolution of my appreciation of comics, and I'm more open to so much more now. And I think a big part of that is because I finally read a good chunk of so many comics that I wanted to read that had certain aesthetics or were certain things that now I'm much more comfortable branching out. I say that as I continue to be a horrific Marvel zombie. And I think I'm almost done with that, and then I'll start branching out again. When I ordered my monthly comics, I made a point to check out a couple, not non-brand comics, to try a couple things. So we're getting there. The other thing I want to read, Queen and Country, Greg Rucka's stuff. Whiteout too, along with that. Things I've been meaning to read. So I feel like I'm kind of catching up on some noted creators and their works, and I'll be expanding from there. And I know there's some other things people have been saying I need to read forever that I need to get around to. Like finishing Cerebus someday. I'm not putting that on my docket anytime soon. Black Hole. Going to maybe reading some of the Crumb stuff, or Harvey Pekar. I don't know, I'm looking just at my shelves, like reading some Elephant Men might be good. That's something I've meant to do forever. Another thing I'm not putting on my docket anytime soon is I have a Sandman read through that I've been planning forever, which is going to involve reading the Absolutes and the annotated versions. And doing that, and reading a few books of essays I have on Sandman as well as part of that. And that sounds like a project that I want to do something with, but I don't even know what. Yeah. So, tell me what you've been reading. I'm curious, and I'll catch you soon.